You're in a relationship that you give, 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 give. You listen, you show up, and you make allowances for their behavior. You explain yourself, you try to keep the peace, and somehow your needs always seem to come last. So eventually you find yourself thinking, why do people always treat me this way? Maybe it's not a relationship. Maybe it's your family. Maybe you're the one everyone calls when they need something. Right? Oh, the famous, they need something, so they're always looking to you. The one expected to understand, the one who's supposed to forgive, the one who keeps making room for everyone else, while nobody seems to make room for you. Or maybe it's at work. You're constantly doing more than you're asked. You take responsibility. You don't complain. You make things easier for everyone around you. And then someone else gets the recognition again. And you think, why does this keep happening to me? Now, here's where things get uncomfortable. What if the problem isn't simply that you're surrounded by people who don't value you? What if there's a program running underneath your identity that keeps telling you, this is what I have to do to be valued? And because you believe it, you keep participating in situations that require you to prove your value. Not consciously, you may actually believe you're choosing these situations freely, but your internal programming is influencing what you accept, what you expect, and what you tolerate, and where you draw the line. And eventually, someone comes along and behaves exactly in the way your existing identity has learned to accommodate, and then they seem to confirm the story. See? People don't appreciate me. That's the mirror. And this is where creating your reality gets much more uncomfortable than most people want it to be. Because we're not just talking about what you want. We're talking about what your identity has been trained to expect. So if you keep asking, why do people always treat me in this way? I'm going to ask you a different question. What program are you running that keeps giving this behavior somewhere to land? Because that's where we're going next. Let's take this out of the abstract for a minute, okay? We are going to make this real because you might be listening to this thinking, okay, but what does that actually look like? Well, it can look like the person who says, I always end up with emotionally unavailable people. And maybe that's true. Maybe you've had several relationships where the other person wasn't capable of giving you what you needed. But now let's look at the other side of the mirror. What happens when someone actually shows up emotionally available? Do you trust it? Do you relax into it? Or does some part of you become suspicious? Do you wonder what's wrong with them? Do you start looking for the catch? There has to be a catch. Or do you lose interest because the relationship doesn't have the same emotional intensity you're used to? That's something worth examining, because sometimes we think we're choosing what we want when we're actually choosing what our system recognizes. And those are not always the same thing. You can consciously want peace while unconsciously being familiar with chaos. You can consciously want consistency while unconsciously being drawn toward unpredictability. And you can consciously want someone who communicates while carrying an identity that says, people eventually pull away. And if that's the program underneath you, you may interpret every small change in someone's behavior as confirmation that they're leaving. They take longer to respond. They're busy for a day. Their energy changes, and immediately the story starts. Here comes the story. Oh, they're losing interest. They're pulling away. I knew this would happen. And now you're reacting to something that may not actually be happening in the way your program is interpreting it. The program creates the expectation. The expectation influences the interpretation. The interpretation influences your response. Your response changes the interaction, and then the interaction becomes evidence. See? I was right. And that's how these loops become self-reinforcing. And this is why the mirror isn't simply about looking at what other people are doing. It is about becoming aware of how you're participating in the experience. Not blaming yourself, not taking responsibility for somebody else's behavior, but becoming curious about your side of the pattern. We're going to take another example. Maybe you constantly feel like people take advantage of you. Oh, that was me. That was me so many years ago. That was me. You're always the one helping. You're always available. Someone needs something, boom, you're there. Someone has a problem, boom, you're there. Someone needs an emotional support, you're there. I was there all the time. But when you need something, like I did, right? Suddenly no one's around or everyone's busy. And eventually you become resentful and you think nobody ever shows up for me. And maybe they don't. But here's the mirror. Why are you so available to everyone else? Why is saying no so difficult? What happens inside you when someone is disappointed with you? Do you feel guilty? Do you immediately want to fix it? Do you worry that they'll think you're selfish? Do you believe being a good person means always being available? Because if your internal program says my value comes from what I do for other people, then overgiving isn't random. It's part of the identity. And when you overgive, you teach the relationship something. You teach people what access to you looks like. You teach them what you will continue doing again. This doesn't mean someone who takes advantage of you is innocent. No way, because they're responsible for their behavior. But you're responsible for noticing when a pattern keeps repeating and asking, why am I continuing to participate in this? That's a very different question, and it's a much more empowering one. Okay? Maybe your pattern is people crossing your boundaries. You tell yourself, I have boundaries, but the moment somebody crosses one, you explain it. You negotiate, you give it another chance, or you make an exception, then another and another, until the boundary has become simply a suggestion. Then you get angry because the other person doesn't respect it. But here's the uncomfortable part. A boundary isn't just what you say. It is what you do when the boundary is crossed. And sometimes the mirror shows us that the problem isn't that we don't know what our boundary is. It's that we don't yet trust ourselves enough to enforce it. So the deeper program might not be people don't respect me. It might be I don't trust myself to handle what happens if I say no. And that's very different because now you have something you can actually work with. You can begin asking, what am I afraid will happen if I disappoint someone? What am I afraid I'll lose? What am I afraid they'll think? What am I making their reaction mean about me? And that's the work. And now there is the pattern of you feeling sometimes that you are being criticized. You feel like people are always judging you, always finding something wrong, always telling you what you should be doing. And you spend your life trying to prove yourself. You become better, more successful, more helpful, more accomplished, and you try to get it right. You try to become undeniable. But no matter how much you do, there's this feeling that you're not enough. So you keep trying. And this is where we have to ask, who are you trying to convince? Because sometimes the external critic has become an internal voice. You don't even need somebody else to criticize you anymore. You do that for them. You anticipate what they'll say. You second guess yourself. You criticize your choices before anybody else has a chance to. And then when someone does criticize you, it lands directly on a belief that was already there. That's the mirror again. The outside experience is touching something that already exists inside. And this is why I want you to be careful with the phrase, I create my own reality, because it can be misunderstood. Creating your reality does not mean you consciously choose every difficult thing that has happened to you. It doesn't mean you cause somebody else's reactions. It doesn't mean you should blame yourself for being hurt. It doesn't mean you can control every person, event, or circumstance around you. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the reality you continue to participate in, the patterns you continue to reinforce, the identity you continue to live from, the expectations you continue to carry, the behaviors you continue to repeat, the things you continue to tolerate, the choices you make because they feel familiar. That's where your creative power becomes visible, because you may not control what someone else does, but you do have a relationship with what you do next. And what you do next matters. Think about someone who constantly says, people don't listen to me. Maybe they enter a conversation already expecting not to be heard. They don't clearly say what they need. They soften everything. They say it's okay when it isn't. They don't want to be difficult. They don't want conflict. So the other person doesn't actually receive a clear message. Then the person walks away thinking, nobody listens to me again. The other person still has responsibility for their behavior, don't get me wrong, but there is a pattern here worth examining. What are you communicating? What are you actually saying? What are you assuming? What are you tolerating? What are you teaching people about how to relate to you? This is where the mirror becomes incredibly powerful, because instead of saying, why are people like this? You start saying, what happens inside me when I encounter this? And that's where the real information is. And sometimes the program is incredibly simple. I have to be useful to be loved. I have to be easy to be accepted. I have to be strong because nobody is coming to help me. I have to stay quiet to keep the peace. I have to achieve to be worthy. I have to take care of everyone. I can't depend on anyone. I don't need anyone. I have to prove myself. I shouldn't ask for too much. I need to be perfect. I need to be needed. I have to keep control. These are all programs. And when a program is running long enough, it stops feeling like a belief. It starts feeling like who you are. That's the part I really want you to hear, because you might say, that's just me. Is it? Is it really? Or is that the identity you've practiced the longest? Because there is a difference. And this is where stage 2 becomes the mirror. The mirror isn't showing you who you are at your deepest level. It's showing you what you've been practicing. It's showing you what you've learned. It's showing you what your nervous system has become familiar with. It's showing you the identity you're currently living from. And sometimes that reflection isn't comfortable, because maybe you've spent years saying, I'm independent. But underneath that independence is, I don't trust anyone. Maybe you've said, I'm just a really giving person. But underneath that is, I don't know how to receive. Maybe you've said, I'm a people pleaser. But underneath that is, I'm afraid of what happens when someone doesn't like me. Maybe you've said, I always attract difficult people. But underneath that is, I keep trying to earn love from people who make me work for it. Now we're getting somewhere, because the label isn't the program. The behavior isn't the program. There's usually something underneath it. And that's what we want to find. So here's something I want you to start doing. When you notice yourself saying, people always, stop. Just stop. People always take advantage of me. Stop. People always leave. Stop. People always disrespect me. Stop. People never appreciate me. Stop. And ask, what is this experience reflecting back to me? Then go one layer deeper. You got to go deep, my friends. What am I believing about myself here? And then deeper again. What am I doing because I believe that? And deeper still. What am I afraid would happen if I stopped doing it? That last question can change everything, because that's where you often find the program protecting itself. Maybe you're afraid that if you stop overgiving, people will leave. Let them leave. That's what I did. They all left. I don't care. I'm done overgiving. I'm done giving. Maybe you're afraid that if you stop proving yourself, you'll be overlooked. Maybe you're afraid that if you set the boundary, you'll be rejected. Maybe you're afraid that if you stop fixing everything, everything will fall apart. Maybe you're afraid that if you stop being the strong one, nobody will be there for you. And now you're no longer just looking at the external event. You're looking at the internal architecture underneath it. And here's the beautiful part, because there is a beautiful part to this, my friends. Once you can see the program, you do not have to obey it. You can pause. You can notice the old response, and you can choose something different. Maybe the old you would immediately say yes. This time you say, let me think about it. Maybe the old you would chase someone who pulls away. This time you don't, okay? You don't go back. Maybe the old you would explain yourself for 20 minutes. This time you simply state what you need. Maybe the old you would tolerate the same behavior for another 6 months. This time you pay attention the first time. Maybe the old you would assume rejection. This time you wait for actual information. Let's just wait. Let's wait and play it out. Don't play it all out in your head. Just wait. Maybe the old you would make someone else's discomfort your responsibility. This time, you allow them to have their reaction. These seem like small changes, but they're not, my friends, because you're changing the program through behavior. You're teaching yourself, I don't have to be who I used to be in order to be safe. I don't have to earn my worth. I don't have to abandon myself to keep someone else. I don't have to repeat what is familiar simply because it's familiar. And when you start living from that identity, your reality has to respond differently, not magically, not instantly, but because you're no longer participating in the same way. And that's the part people often miss when they talk about creating your reality. They think the work is getting the outside world to give them something different. But sometimes the first evidence that your reality is changing is much quieter because you respond differently, you choose differently, and you notice something sooner. You leave sooner. You speak honestly. You stop chasing. You stop explaining. You stop accepting crumbs and calling them a meal. You stop confusing intensity with connection. You stop confusing being needed with being loved. You stop confusing being useful with being worthy. You stop confusing familiarity with safety. And eventually, the people, relationships, opportunities, and circumstances that fit the old version of you don't fit quite the same way anymore. Not because you've controlled them, but because you've changed the person who is participating in the experience. And that's creating your reality. Okay. So if you're sitting there right now thinking, why do people always treat me this way? I don't want you to turn that question into self-blame. I want you to turn it into curiosity. Look at the pattern, look at the people, look at the situations, but then you have to look at yourself. And what do you keep expecting? What do you keep tolerating? What do you keep defending? And what do you keep excusing? What do you keep trying to prove? What do you keep believing you have to do to be loved, respected, accepted, safe, successful, or worthy? And most importantly, what version of you keeps showing up to the same pattern? Because that is the mirror. The mirror isn't here to tell you, you created every bad thing that's happened to you. No, the mirror is here to say, there is something here you now have the power to see. And once you see it, you have a choice. You can keep defending the pattern, you can keep blaming the people, or you can keep collecting evidence that your story is true. Or you can become curious about the program underneath the story because maybe the people in your life aren't always showing you who you are. Maybe they're showing you what you've learned to accept as well. Maybe they're showing you the identity you've been unconsciously rehearsing. And maybe the most powerful thing you can do isn't to make them change. Maybe it's to stop being the version of you that needs them to behave that way. That's where the mirror becomes a doorway, because once you can see the program, you can interrupt it. And once you interrupt it, you can choose something different, not from desperation, not from fear, not from the old identity, but from awareness. And that's when you begin to discover something very important. Okay. Your reality doesn't change simply because you want something different. It begins to change when you stop participating in it as the person who created the old pattern. Okay. That's the work. That's the mirror. And we're just beginning. Before you leave this lesson, I want you to take a moment and sit with one question. Yes, another question. I know I ask a lot of questions, but that's where we get to where we're going, right? What pattern keeps showing up in my life that I am now ready to see differently? Don't rush it, okay? Don't look for the easy answer, because the first answer is usually the surface. I want you to go deep. Ask yourself, what keeps repeating? What do I keep tolerating? What belief about myself does this experience seem to confirm? And most importantly, who would I have to become if I no longer needed this pattern to feel familiar? That is the real work of the mirror, because awareness is where change begins. The moment you can see the program, you are no longer trapped inside of it. You now have a choice. And if this lesson connected with you, I invite you to share in the comments the pattern I am ready to see is, and let me know. You don't have to share your entire story, okay? It's just name the pattern. Because when we bring something into awareness, we begin to take away its power over us. And if you feel called to go deeper into this work, the turn continues beyond these videos. Inside the community, we are not just talking about transformation. We are working through the actual process of seeing the patterns, understanding the programming, and rebuilding the identity that creates your next reality. The mirror is only the beginning, because once you see yourself clearly, you can no longer unknow what you have discovered. So join me, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to join our Patreon community where we dive in deeper and have meaningful discussions with one another so that we can show and see maybe a different perspective that someone else isn't catching right away. I wish you the best. Take care, and I'll see you on our next video.